Fantasy, where the hero has to go through a great test of their strength, just like I have to go through the test of moving this mattress by myself. Don't mind me, I'm just trying to gain enough strength and courage to pass this character building test I have here of putting this office back together. Welcome back to Dragons and Astronauts, your weekly deep dive into the world of science fiction and fantasy. And this week, I try to explain the history of the fantasy genre while I put back together my office. Let's get after it. So last week, we discussed science fiction, what science fiction is, where science fiction comes from, why Mary Shelley is a bad bitch, and why science fiction is important. This week, we are going to be doing something similar with the fantasy genre. Simply put, fantasy is a genre of fiction where these stories do not take place in the real world. Fantasy is normally known for a couple of their distinguishing traits. That is, you have different worlds, different magic systems, different mythical creatures and beings, as well as some common themes. These are good versus evil, a quest of some sort for an object or power or to save the day, an epic journey, the hero cycle, or even man versus nature, man versus himself, man versus society. And I've also touched on before in episode 1 a couple different kinds of subgenres of fantasy, but fantasy normally falls into two camps. High fantasy, or epic fantasy, think Game of Thrones, and low fantasy, which is more contemporary. Think Any Way the Wind Blows by Rainbow Rowell. But where does fantasy come from? So I touched on this a little bit in my science fiction video, that the origins of sci-fi are very speculative because science fiction comes with the rise of science being understood in modern day. But for fantasy, it's a little bit easier to pin down the predecessors because the easiest way to kind of think of early fantasy is mythology, such as the Odyssey or myths and legends from cultures around the world. Right here, I'm holding up a book of Egyptian mythology. In fact, the Odyssey, which was written by Homer in the 8th century BC, is a renowned classic of world literature, and some consider it to be the earliest pinned down fantasy we have, where the main character, Odysseus, goes on a fantastical journey home. And this claim isn't unfounded. The Odyssey contains a lot of fantastical elements that we would see as precursors of the modern day fantasy genre. There is a treacherous quest that Odysseus must go on to get home, mythical creatures such as the Cyclops, sophisticated characters, as well as this presence of magic and the gods. Now, you might be saying, okay, but fantastical elements have always been part of myths and legends. Like, that's kind of the great idea. And a lot of these texts have a religious element to them. And for that, you are correct. Because here's the big difference between the Odyssey and a modern day story such as Harry Potter, is that for modern fantasy, the author and the readers understand the work to be fictitious, while in the ancient world, works such as the Odyssey or other myths and legends were actually considered to be somewhat true, if not fact. So where does modern fantasy fit into all of this? Well, modern fantasy normally gets pinned down to the 19th century, following a period of chivalrous and European romances with fantastical elements, which could still be considered somewhat believable. Scottish author George MacDonald, whose novel Phantastes featured a young man drawn into a dream world where he has a series of adventures, and is credited with writing the first plainly fictitious fantasy for adults. There's also The Well at World's End by William Morris. In the 1800s, there was also the publication of the German-inspired fairy tales, The Brothers Grimm, as well as the writings of Hans Christian Andersen. In these collections, readers were introduced to, for the first time, Cinderella, The Little Mermaid, Rapunzel, The Snow Queen, etc. While these original fairy tales were much darker and used to impart harsh lessons, no one can deny the impact that they had on popular culture since their release. And these early works include a lot of these elements known to modern fantasy: castles, kingdoms, princesses, knights, dragons, quests, etc. But we get a lot of these elements from earlier on in English literature, and I mean like English, I mean like prestigious English, such as Beowulf and the King Arthur tales. Once again, folklore. But the Victorian age saw the publication of the most groundbreaking and influential fantasy novels at the time, which is Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Not only did this novel introduce a female protagonist who is not punished for venturing out on her own adventure without a male guardian, but the entire premise of entering a new world of fantastical creatures through a magical doorway has become its own subgenre. This isn't gonna fit. And then at the turn of the century in 1900, we had the publication of Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz, as well as J.M. Barrier's Peter Pan in 1904. But these early works, Peter Pan, Wizard of Oz, kind of solidified the idea that fantasy was meant for children to teach children to listen to adults and not be a pain in the butt. But fantasy grows more mainstream in the 1950s and more acceptable for adults with publications such as The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Martin. And Martin's publication of The Lord of the Rings is what is considered the most important commercial work of ushering fantasy into the world of commercial fiction. Tolkien had some successful contemporaries, such as C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, and Ursula K. Le Guin, author of Earthsea. Tolkien's work became the pedestal on which all other fantasy was judged. Not only did Tolkien raise the bars for the depths of which fantasy can be reached, but also made fantasy popular. And for the next 2 decades, the fantasy books that came out were largely reactionary to the Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings. There was Terry Brooks' Shannara series, and in the 1970s, there was also the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, which I hope to avoid playing with my friends because if moving this mattress is complicated, I can't imagine having a polysexual octopus in space with 18 Glocks. But in the 90s, we also have 2 breakthrough hits. We have Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling, as well as the publication of the first Song of Ice and Fire book by George R.R. Martin in 1996. And once again, these books changed the genre forever. A Song of Ice and Fire revolves around a complicated web of characters, each with their own agenda in mind. All of these characters trying to secure the Iron Throne, the royal seat of Westeros. Harry Potter has also been a cultural phenomenon when it was first released in 2001, and has a deep impact on how far the depths of a magic system can go in fantasy. The series follows Harry Potter and his band of wizard friends around the adventures they have at Hogwarts, a school for wizards. As for modern day, fantasy is incredibly popular as a genre. Fantasy has always been important, right? But it has become huge since Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones being one of the most successful television series of all time. And since then, every single network has scrambled to create an ensemble just like Game of Thrones. Take, for example, Leigh Bardugo's Six of Crows series. Netflix has recently adapted Six of Crows in an epic fantasy ensemble series, in an attempt to take on some of that magic caught by Game of Thrones, as well as capture a bit of that sweet, sweet young adult audience. And I think that business decision speaks to the popularity of fantasy right now. Fantasy is not just for adults anymore, and it's certainly not geared for children. Fantasy is marketable as... Have I watched Six of Crows yet? No, I'm like 2 episodes in, and then I got distracted by RuPaul's Drag Race. So where is fantasy headed today? Well, I see fantasy becoming a lot more diverse and explorative throughout the world. For example, we're getting a lot more publications from authors of color featuring fantasies of underrepresented characters. If you are looking for an adult recommendation of that, a very adult recommendation of that, I would recommend The Poppy War. So I've asked this question last week as to why science fiction is important. And I said that science fiction is important because it allows the reader to go through this thought experiment of their head of what could scientifically happen in the future. I used last week the example of George Orwell's 1984 as an example of what could happen when the government starts restricting the free speech rights of its citizenry. And through 1984, we know that is a very, 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 very bad idea. But what gives about fantasy? Because fantasy isn't going to happen in real life. You know, the Avengers aren't going to show up. Dragons aren't going to fly through the sky. Hagrid is not going to pop up when you're 11 and tell you you're a wizard. I think the value of fantasy is purely that. It's fun and it's escapism. And if nothing else, even though it isn't quite a projection of a thought experiment in the future for what could happen, the themes of fantasy are still very valid. But anyway, I want to hear from you. What is your favorite fantasy novel of all time and why? Comment down below. Personally, it's pretty hard, but I did read the Odyssey for the first time in 9th grade, and it did change my life. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. If you are a student or just curious what sources I used for today's video, they're linked below in my website in case you are a student or you're just curious. I also have a podcast coming out, same name, Dragons and Astronauts, which will be available on all of your major podcast platforms. And as always, thanks for watching and happy reading.